Alright friends, this is your first and only warning. I'm about to share my opinions about music. You are more than welcome to disagree with me, I just ask that you disagree civilly. Periphery is my favorite band, and it's not even close. I've been a fan for more than a decade, and I know my way around their discography pretty well. But when Periphery 5 dropped back in March, I decided to go through and listen to their entire discography from start to finish and rank all their albums from worst to best. This ranking is going to include all 5 studio albums, along with Clear, the Icarus EP, and Juggernaut's Alpha and Omega. All I'm leaving off is the live album, the Periphery 1 instrumental, and a couple of singles. Kicking us off at number 9 is the Icarus EP, and this might be the only place where most Periphery fans will agree with me. I want to be clear that this isn't a bad album, I just think it's their weakest effort. Though this EP has my preferred versions of both Icarus Lives and Jetpacks Was Yes, along with solid tracks in New Groove and Captain On, that's basically it. And I'm really not a fan of the Icarus Lives remixes, but props to the band for getting Zedd to do a remix before he blew up. Again, this is not a bad album. There's good stuff here, but most of it is either improvements / remixes from P1 or songs that were cut from P1. I also want to establish early what I'm going to call the metal to nonsense ratio. This is a very important concept when it comes to Periphery's music. It's the ratio of metal music to whatever nonsense they stick on the end or in the middle of a track. For instance, All New Materials is a song off P1 that's 5 minutes and 20 seconds long, but the actual song ends at like 4 minutes and 10 seconds, at which point there's 70 seconds of weird techno at the end. So that song's metal to nonsense ratio is about 4:1. Periphery does this sort of thing all the time, and while the metal to nonsense ratio isn't that important to me, it will factor slightly into how I rank these albums. The Icarus EP fittingly has the worst metal to nonsense ratio of Periphery's entire discography, given that almost half the tracks are remixes. Though the non-remix tracks are actually fairly concise, the remixes bring the metal to nonsense ratio to like 3:2 on this one. It should also be noted that the Icarus EP has by far the shortest average track length of any Periphery album. This is a 9-song EP that runs 33 minutes, with the longest track coming in at 5 minutes and 16 seconds. For comparison, Periphery 5 also has 9 songs but runs 70 minutes, with 6 tracks out of 9 running at least 7 minutes. As far as metal music goes, the Icarus EP is fine, but as far as the Periphery discography goes, it's the worst. I really wanted to rank this album higher, I just couldn't justify it. Coming in at number 8, it's Periphery 1. While I think you can argue that this is one of the most important albums in the history of progressive metal, it's also absolutely lapped by the rest of Periphery's discography. I think the best way I can describe this album is that it sounds the way your college roommate's first attempt at cooking filet tastes. It's poorly seasoned and overcooked, but it's still filet. The potential is there, there's just lots of room for improvement. The production on this album is awful by Periphery standards, to the point where I feel like most of the Bulb demos on which these songs are based actually sound better than their Periphery 1 counterparts. And while I think Spencer Sotelo is a superb vocalist, the vocals on P1 are subpar, and the album works almost as well as an instrumental as it does an album with vocals, which I don't think can be said about any other Periphery release. But Periphery 1 and the Icarus EP are outliers in the Periphery canon because Periphery was still just kind of a Bulb cover band at this point. For those that aren't aware, Misha Mansour actually created most of the early Periphery tracks by himself and released them as demos under the name Bulb. Bulb and Periphery kind of existed in parallel in these early years, with songs sort of flowing back and forth between the two projects. There were also a ton of lineup changes in the early days, and the band as we know it today didn't really exist until Periphery 2, which, spoiler alert, we won't be talking about for a long time. So the Icarus EP and Periphery 1 feel like the physical manifestations of the growing pains the band experienced as they figured out who they were and how they wanted to sound. This is the true rationale for ranking these two albums in last place. I still think the music is quality, they just don't feel like true Periphery releases because the band hadn't found its footing yet. Early Periphery issues aside, there's still a lot to like here. All New Materials and Icarus Lives are my personal favorites, but I also dig Insomnia, Jetpacks Was Yes, Butter Snips, and Race Car. A low-tier Periphery album is still a damn good metal album. As far as metal to nonsense ratio goes, it's about 4:1 on this album. There are a lot of long, weird techno outros that I don't like very much, but they aren't too bad.
I guess it's not too bad.
Alright, now that we've covered the Icarus EP and Periphery 1, that gets the Periphery Dark Ages out of the way, so we can move on to bigger and better things. At number 7, we have Juggernaut Alpha, which I'm ranking separately from Omega. I will fully admit that going into this album ranking project, this was the album I had listened to the least. I was kind of hoping that I would regret not giving it more attention, but I honestly don't. While I could easily have ranked this album last and not lost any sleep over it, I give it props for its execution and general feeling of completeness. I'm a big fan of the songs Alpha, 22 Faces, and Heavy Heart, while songs like MK Ultra and The Scourge drag the album down for me. Overall, Alpha has good tonal consistency, and the production quality is much higher than P1, which pushes it over the edge for me. Though P1 has more bangers, it has more stinkers too. Concept albums can be a little tough to evaluate, but I think there's a decent bit to like here. Alright, this one pains me a little, I'll admit it, but at number 6 we have Periphery 5, Gent is Not a Genre. Ranking P5 in 6th is not what I wanted to do. I really wanted to love this album, but I just didn't. Atropos and Waxwings are masterpieces, but the rest of this album just isn't for me. Periphery started writing P5 at a really weird time, and they spent more time on it than any other album. I think their process was so relaxed that P5 lacks a fair bit of clarity and focus. The metal to nonsense ratio is off the charts for this one too, the worst of the studio albums by far. The outros are endless, there's orchestral music, a jazz breakdown. Look, I'm really glad the guys are having fun. This just didn't land for me. But I've also found Periphery's music to get more approachable with time. The recency bias can do them a bit of a disservice, and I find that I like a lot of their stuff more once I've sat with it for a while. So my opinion of this album may improve at some point, but only time will tell. Despite my relative disappointment with this album, it still has incredible production and performances from the entire band. It definitely has its moments, but it mostly feels like a bloated mess that's 20 minutes longer than it needs to be. Coming in at number 5, I have the heavier half of the Juggernaut double album, Omega. This is a great little album. It only has 7 songs, but they tie in beautifully with one another. Stranger Things, Omega, and Priestess are the standouts here, with Priestess being one of my all-time favorite Periphery tracks. It's a departure from their normal sound and a departure from the album itself, but it's the exact foot off the gas that the album needs to keep it from being too heavy and thematically dark. Though I think the best parts of Periphery 5 are better than the best parts of this album, Omega is more consistent and it has a better idea of what it's trying to do and where it's going.
I know what I'm doing.
Alright, we're into the top 4. It's bangers only from here on out. At number 4, I have the Clear EP, and this was by far the biggest surprise of the entire ranking for me. Clear came out when I was like 17, and I distinctly remember finding the Parade of Ashes, really digging it, and absolutely disregarding the rest of the EP for no damn reason. Clear goes really hard, and I genuinely regret disrespecting it all those years ago because I've been missing out on some awesome Periphery tracks. Clear is surprisingly cohesive considering the fact that every track was supervised by a different member of the band. The songs are concise, they hit hard, and everything feels special in its own way. Each track almost feels like an autograph from its respective band member. Feed the Ground has crazy rhythm stuff going on and wild drums, indicative of Matt's writing. Zero is an instrumental reminiscent of a Bulb track, and Pale Aura has wistful piano chords and a classic Mark Holcomb riff. I was just really surprised by how much I like this EP. It doesn't have a lot of weak points, and the strong points are really strong. It's also only 29 minutes, the shortest of any Periphery release. Have you hailed Stan recently? Well, have you? If you like CJDX. At number 3, we have Periphery 4, Hail Stan. Periphery has a long and storied history of silly names for both their songs and albums, and Hail Stan is easily my favorite. This album is an absolute force. From its nearly 17-minute opener to its anthemic 10-minute closer, P4 is insane. In my listening and note-taking session, I didn't rank a single song below a 7 out of 10. Reptile is a wild way to start, Garden in the Bones and It's Only Smiles make the middle of the album sensitive and strong, and Satellites closes out the album with what may be the best song Periphery has ever released. I don't know if any single song better epitomizes their style, from the slow start to the heavy hit in the middle that drives and soars all the way to the end. Satellite is the flagship of the album. Like Clear, there aren't a lot of weak points here, and the strong points are some of Periphery's absolute strongest. Even the quote weaker songs that don't stick out as much to me still go super hard. Periphery 4 is an outstanding album, and only 2 remain. Coming in at number 2, we have Periphery 2, This Time It's Personal. Remember way back at number 8 when I said P1 was like your college roommate's bad filet? Well, P2 feels like your college roommate hated his first filet so much that he spent all night on YouTube watching Gordon Ramsay tutorials. The turnaround is drastic and the steak is impeccable.
Take them out. Beautiful. Let them rest.
This is definitely the most nostalgic Periphery album for me. It came out when I was 16 and it carried me through a lot of really tough times. High school sucks, and this album was one of the few things that made that period of my life bearable. I just wasn't aware music could sound like this and make me feel the things this album made me feel. I'm not exaggerating when I say Ragnarok changed my life. I like that song so much that I paid for Skype lessons with Matt Halpern so he could teach me how to play it. All these years later, it's still my favorite. If I'm hanging out with someone who doesn't know Periphery, Ragnarok is the first track I show them. And if you are into Periphery, this album has everything. We're talking long thematic outros tied together by an instrumental electronic song in the middle, lyrical and musical theming throughout, hard-hitting songs, emotional songs, a song called Frog and Bullfish. Like, what more do you want? There are only a couple of things holding this album back from being truly perfect. While the songs are nostalgic, I still don't vibe much with the outros and Epoch. They work okay, I just think the album would be better without them. Periphery 2's production is also pretty lacking compared to any album that comes after it. It's an improvement over P1, but still well behind their future releases. All that being said though, this album is amazing. And rounding off the ranking is my absolute favorite Periphery album, Periphery 3 Select Difficulty. Not only do I consider this to be Periphery's masterpiece, I think it's one of the greatest albums in the history of rock music. This is the album where Periphery put all the pieces together and left everything on the field. The production is superb, the songwriting is excellent, the performances are amazing, and the tour that accompanied this album was peak Periphery. There was absolutely nothing like it. I saw them live right after this album dropped, and that concert was one of the single greatest nights of my life. They were selling VIP passes for $50, so when I bought one, I got to meet the entire band, I got their autographs, I got to play their guitars and take pictures, and then I was treated to the greatest concert that I have ever seen. Hearing songs like Flatline and Loon live is probably the closest I've ever come to a religious experience. So Periphery 2 got me through high school, but Periphery 3 made me a fucking grown-up. And while this album definitely has some heavy hitters, it's a pretty drastic change of pace from P1 and P2. Catch Fire and Loon are two of the most melodic and heartfelt songs the band has ever released, and The Way the News Goes almost feels like a punk song, but it still hits really hard and drives like hell. And if we're talking about metal to nonsense ratio, only 2 songs on the entire album have an outro, and I actually don't mind either of them. It's just genuinely difficult for me to come up with anything that I don't like about this album. Going into my listening experience, I kind of thought P2 would edge P3 out because it's such a masterclass, but P3 fires on all cylinders from beginning to end, and I just can't justify putting it anywhere but in the #1 spot.
He was #1!
And that concludes the ranking of Periphery's entire discography. If you've made it this far, I have to assume you're a pretty big Periphery fan, so I want to hear your thoughts. Do you agree with my ranking? Do you disagree? Let me know your thoughts, and thanks for watching.